The day of the funeral was supposed to be quiet, a moment for grief, not suspicion. But before the service even ended, someone stood up and demanded proof that what I'd inherited was real. Not in private, not later, right there, in front of family, neighbors, and strangers who had no idea what was coming next. I had just inherited 900 acres of land the HOA had quietly been circling for years. And in that single, disrespectful moment, they made a mistake that would unravel everything they thought they controlled. Because when power meets entitlement at the wrong time, it doesn't just create conflict. It creates consequences they never saw coming. Before everything fell apart, life on that land was quiet in a way most people never experience. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned. Mornings started with open sky instead of traffic, with wind moving through grass instead of engines and horns. The land stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Rolling fields, tree lines that marked old boundaries, and long dirt paths worn down by decades of use. 900 acres sounds like a number meant for bragging, but in reality, it felt like responsibility. It felt like history. The property had been in my family longer than I'd been alive. It wasn't pristine or manicured in the way developers like to advertise. It was working land, grazed, walked, repaired, and respected. Every fence line existed for a reason. Every worn trail told a story. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. And until recently, no one questioned who it belonged to or how it was used, that I didn't grow up expecting to inherit it. Like most families, we assumed things would stay the same for years. The land was overseen quietly, taxes paid on time, boundaries respected. I lived nearby, but not on the main parcel, visiting often, helping when needed, and staying out of the way when I wasn't. There was comfort in that arrangement. Nothing dramatic. Nothing controversial. What changed everything wasn't greed or ambition on my part. It was loss. The inheritance came suddenly, wrapped in grief rather than celebration. There was no announcement, no public declaration. Paperwork moved quietly through legal channels the way it always had. Titles transferred, documents filed, records updated. Everything was handled by professionals who had done this many times before. Nothing about it felt unusual, except for the way certain people began paying attention. The community surrounding the land had changed over the years. What used to be open countryside had slowly filled in with neatly planned neighborhoods, uniform mailboxes, identical fences, and rules posted where trees used to stand. An HOA had formed years earlier, governing a development that bordered part of the property. At first, it barely registered. Their rules didn't apply to the land. Their meetings didn't involve us. There was a clear boundary, legally and physically. But growth has a way of blurring lines. As the neighborhood expanded, so did the HOA's sense of importance. More homes meant more dues, more authority, and more confidence. They took pride in order, uniformity, and control. Lawns trimmed to exact measurements. Approved paint colors. Restrictions written in language most residents never fully read. It worked for the people who bought into it willingly. The land, however, didn't fit their image. From the HOA's perspective, it was an inconvenience. A wide, open stretch that couldn't be standardized or regulated. It didn't match their aesthetic. It didn't follow their rules. And worst of all, it couldn't be easily absorbed. At first, the attention was subtle. Curious glances during board meetings. Casual questions passed along through neighbors who suddenly wanted to know more about property lines and access roads. Nothing aggressive. Nothing overt. Just interest. That interest intensified once word spread that ownership had changed. In communities like that, information travels fast and not always accurately. People talk. They speculate. They fill in gaps with assumptions. An inheritance of that size triggered whispers almost immediately. Some people assumed the land would be sold. Others assumed it would be divided. A few assumed it was only a matter of time before development plans appeared. The HOA, in particular, seemed energized by the uncertainty. They had long-term goals, expansion ideas, infrastructure dreams that required land they didn't own but desperately wanted control over. Walking paths, easements, future access points, things that made sense on paper if no one pushed back. And for years, they had quietly operated under the assumption that someday, the land would be available. They just didn't expect someone to inherit it and keep it. From the outside, everything still looked calm. No notices, no violations, no letters. But underneath, something was shifting. The tone of interactions changed. Polite acknowledgments became formal nods. Friendly indifference turned into measured observation. I noticed it first in the way questions were framed. Not about the land itself, but about authority. Who handled decisions now? Who had final say? Whether boundaries were still accurate? Whether certain paths had been historically shared? Questions that sounded harmless, but were designed to test confidence and knowledge. I answered carefully, briefly, factually. That restraint didn't discourage them. It encouraged them. Because in HOA culture, silence is often interpreted as weakness, and politeness is mistaken for permission. The land itself became a quiet source of tension. Maintenance crews from the neighborhood occasionally strayed too close. Survey flags appeared near boundary lines without notice. A few residents treated certain access points as if they were communal, not private. None of it crossed a clear legal line. Not yet, but it felt intentional. As if they were testing how much resistance existed. Still, I didn't escalate anything. There was too much else going on. Grief has a way of narrowing your focus, and conflict that hasn't fully surfaced feels manageable. I believe that as long as everything was documented and lawful, there was no real threat. I underestimated how personal it was about to become. Because for the HOA, this wasn't just about land. It was about control, image, and entitlement. They weren't dealing with a distant corporation or an anonymous owner. They were dealing with someone they could see, someone they believed they could pressure, someone new, and they were watching closely. The funeral came during that fragile period, a moment meant for closure, reflection, and respect. It brought together family, community members, and acquaintances who had known the land and its history in different ways. It should have been quiet, contained, private. Instead, it became the moment everything surfaced. Not because of what I did, but because of what someone else decided to demand. Up until that point, the conflict had been unspoken, a tension you could sense, but not yet name. After that day, there would be no pretending, no ambiguity, no gentle probing, only open challenge. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. After the funeral, the tension stopped pretending to be polite. It didn't explode all at once. That would have been easier to recognize, easier to respond to. Instead, it crept forward in layers, official-looking paperwork, carefully worded notices, and sudden enforcement of rules that had apparently existed for years but were never mentioned before. The first letter arrived less than 2 weeks later. It wasn't aggressive. It was framed as a clarification, a reminder that certain portions of the land bordering the HOA development were subject to community impact considerations. No accusations, no threats, just a soft implication that my property somehow affected their residents, their views, their walking paths, their sense of order. I ignored it. That was mistake number one. Because ignoring an HOA doesn't make them back off. It convinces them you don't understand how serious they think they are. The next notice came faster. This time, it referenced unauthorized use. According to the HOA, some of the land activities, grazing, equipment storage, maintenance vehicles, were inconsistent with community standards. Standards I had never agreed to. Standards that didn't legally apply to me. Standards written for uniform lawns and decorative fences, not open acreage that existed decades before their neighborhood was ever built. Still, they sent it. Official letterhead. Formal tone. Subtle threat. I responded through proper channels. Short. Documented. Clear. The land was not under HOA jurisdiction. Never had been. Property records supported that fact. For a moment, things went quiet. That silence didn't mean resolution. It meant recalculation. The HOA pivoted from rules to pressure. Surveyors appeared one morning near a fence line that hadn't moved in generations. No prior notice. No request for access. Just equipment, flags, and people behaving as if permission was implied. When confronted, they claimed they were verifying historical easements. There were none, but they didn't stop. Within days, residents began using an old service path on the edge of the land as if it were a public trail. Dog walkers, joggers, even bicycles. When signage went up marking it private, complaints followed almost immediately. Not to me, to the HOA. And the HOA responded by issuing another notice. This one-sided community safety concerns. Apparently, allowing residents to wander onto private land without permission was my responsibility to prevent, and their solution was to fine me if it continued. That's when frustration turned into something sharper. I began documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, copies of letters, property maps, legal descriptions. Every interaction was logged, because it was clear this wasn't going to end with reason or common sense. The HOA escalated again. They accused me of neglect, claimed parts of the land were unsightly, suggested that unmanaged acreage posed risks to neighboring properties. They used language designed to sound neutral while implying negligence. Then came the fines. Small at first, symbolic. A few $100s attached to vague violations. The kind meant to provoke a reaction, to test compliance. I didn't pay them. That refusal shifted their tone entirely. The next communication was no longer about community standards. It was about authority. They questioned the validity of the inheritance, claimed discrepancies in records, suggested that ownership might not be as settled as I believed. It was the same doubt they had shouted at the funeral, now dressed up as formal concern. And that was when it became clear this was never about rules. It was about breaking confidence. The HOA began contacting county offices, requesting documents they already had access to, filing complaints that went nowhere but created delays, raising questions that forced responses. They weren't trying to win outright. They were trying to exhaust. Meanwhile, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. People who once waved now watched. Conversations stopped when I approached. Rumors moved faster than facts. Some residents believed the HOA narrative. Others stayed silent, unwilling to get involved. Pressure thrives in silence. Then came the enforcement attempt. The HOA claimed a portion of the land fell within a shared access corridor they insisted had been used historically by the community. It was false. The corridor existed only on a conceptual planning document, not a deed, not a map, not a legal record. They placed temporary markers anyway. When those markers were removed, another violation notice followed. Larger fine, stronger language, legal references. At this point, the pattern was undeniable. Every response I made led to a new angle of attack. Every boundary I reinforced prompted a new attempt to blur it. The land itself became a battleground. Maintenance vehicles were reported for noise disturbances. Livestock activity was framed as a nuisance. Natural runoff was blamed for drainage issues inside the development. None of it held up under scrutiny, but each complaint forced time, energy, and attention. That was the real cost. It wasn't money. It was focus. The HOA scheduled a board meeting and placed my property on the agenda without notifying me directly. The topic, Community Impact Review. Translation, a public forum to discuss land they didn't own. I found out through a third party. By then, the story circulating wasn't about boundaries or law. It was about morality. Whether one person should hold so much land next to a growing community. Whether it was fair. Whether compromise was owed. They framed entitlement as fairness. At the meeting, decisions were floated but not finalized. Proposals, committees, future action items. Enough momentum to justify continued involvement. Enough ambiguity to keep pushing. Soon after, I received a notice hinting at legal action if cooperation wasn't demonstrated. That word, cooperation, appeared repeatedly. It never meant discussion. It meant surrender. What they wanted wasn't a compromise. It was access, control, precedent. If they could force one concession, the rest would follow. They underestimated one thing. I wasn't isolated. Quietly, professionals were brought in. Title specialists, land attorneys, surveyors with no connection to the HOA. Every claim was examined, every angle assessed. The conclusion was consistent. The HOA had no authority, no claim, and no legal footing. But they didn't know that yet. They continued to push, emboldened by the absence of immediate consequences, until they crossed another line. A cease and desist letter was issued, not to me, but to the HOA, instructing them to stop misrepresenting jurisdiction and interfering with private property. Their response was immediate. They challenged it. They questioned the authority of my representation. They doubled down on their claims. They sent notices not just to me, but to adjacent owners, implying that my land posed risks to the community. That move backfired. Because it drew attention, county officials began asking questions, not about the land, but about the HOA's actions. Records were reviewed. Complaints were cross-referenced. Patterns emerged. And still, the HOA pushed forward, convinced that escalation would force compliance. They scheduled another meeting. This one included a proposal to formally pursue legal remedies regarding access and use. That was the moment everything teetered. Because once legal action is threatened publicly, it stops being posturing. It becomes exposure. Every letter, every fine, every misrepresentation becomes evidence. Every emotional decision becomes traceable. The HOA believed they were tightening control. In reality, they were building a case against themselves. The final escalation came quietly. A notice appeared on my property, improperly posted, incorrectly referenced, asserting an intent to assert community rights over a section of land. It was the boldest move yet, and the most reckless, because by then, every document was in place. Every boundary was verified. Every action was recorded. They thought they were forcing a reaction. What they were actually doing was setting the stage for the moment they would lose everything they thought they had power over. The moment everything broke open didn't come with shouting or chaos. It came with paperwork. By the time the HOA announced its intent to pursue legal action, the ground beneath them was already unstable. They just didn't know it yet. Their confidence was loud, public, and misplaced. Board members spoke in absolutes. Notices went out with bold language and legal references meant to intimidate. They believed escalation was leverage. What they failed to understand was that escalation cuts both ways. The decisive countermove wasn't dramatic from the outside. There were no raised voices or public confrontations. Instead, a comprehensive legal response landed quietly and all at once, not just disputing their claims, but dismantling them piece by piece. Every assertion the HOA had made was addressed. Every boundary was documented. Every misrepresentation was exposed. And most importantly, every overreach was traced back to them. What had once felt like a series of isolated annoyances was now presented as a pattern. Not mistakes, not misunderstandings. A pattern of harassment, misrepresentation, and unauthorized interference with private property. The HOA was no longer the aggressor in control of the narrative. They were the subject of scrutiny. The turning point came when county officials formally acknowledged receipt of complaints, not from me, but regarding the HOA itself. Their actions had crossed administrative lines. Their notices had referenced authorities they didn't possess. Their fines were issued without jurisdiction. Their interference had been documented by third parties. Suddenly, the same officials the HOA had relied on to pressure me were asking them to justify their behavior. That shift happened faster than anyone expected. A formal review was initiated. Records were requested. Meeting minutes, enforcement logs, correspondence, all of it. The HOA was required to explain why they had repeatedly acted outside their authority and why they had continued even after being warned to stop. The response from the board was defensive and fragmented. Some tried to minimize. Others tried to deflect. A few attempted to reframe the situation as a community misunderstanding. But the documentation didn't allow for ambiguity. Dates, times, and actions told a clear story, and it wasn't the one they had been telling residents. The tension peaked at a public meeting that was meant to reaffirm HOA authority. Instead, it exposed its collapse. What was supposed to be a controlled environment quickly became something else. Not chaos, but discomfort. Board members were visibly unsettled. Their confidence gave way to rigid posture and carefully chosen words. They knew they were being watched now, not just by residents, but by officials and advisors who understood the implications of overreach. The agenda item regarding my property was addressed last. By then, the room had shifted. Residents were no longer listening as passive participants. They were connecting dots. Questions that had been dismissed for months were resurfacing. Why was the HOA spending resources on land it didn't own? Why were fines issued without clear authority? Why had boundaries been challenged without evidence? The narrative cracked. Then came the legal bombshell. A summary of findings was formally introduced, not by the HOA, but as part of the ongoing review. It outlined unauthorized actions, improper enforcement attempts, and potential liabilities. It made clear that continued interference could result in penalties far exceeding anything the HOA had imagined imposing. The balance of power inverted instantly. The same board that had once threatened legal action was now being warned against it. What followed wasn't shouting or denial. It was silence. The kind of silence that signals realization. Because the HOA wasn't just facing one homeowner anymore. They were facing consequences that could affect the entire organization. Financial liability. loss of authority, potential dissolution. Everything they had built their control on was suddenly at risk. The most shocking moment wasn't public humiliation. It was retreat. Within days, notices were quietly withdrawn. Fines were rescinded without explanation. Enforcement actions stopped abruptly. The temporary markers vanished overnight. The access proposals were removed from future agendas. No apology, no acknowledgement, just withdrawal. But the story didn't end there. The review continued. And as it did, more issues surfaced. Unrelated complaints from other residents, previous enforcement inconsistencies, financial irregularities tied to aggressive expansion efforts. The HOA's attempt to dominate one piece of land had opened scrutiny into everything else. What had started as an effort to pressure a single owner had triggered a much larger reckoning. Board members began resigning. First one, then another, then a third. The remaining leadership scrambled to stabilize, but trust had already eroded. Residents who once assumed authority was being exercised responsibly now questioned every decision. Attendance at meetings surged, not in support, but in demand for answers. The HOA's power depended on passive compliance. That compliance was gone. The most intense moment came not in a courtroom, but in a decision. Faced with mounting scrutiny and potential penalties, the HOA formally acknowledged that it had no jurisdiction over the land. The statement was carefully worded, legally vetted, and emotionally hollow, but it was undeniable. They had lost. Everything they had pushed for, access, influence, control, was gone. And in trying to force submission, they had exposed themselves to consequences far greater than restraint would have ever cost them. For me, the victory didn't feel triumphant at first. It felt heavy, because the fight wasn't just about land anymore. It was about dignity, about being targeted during grief, about having authority questioned publicly, repeatedly, and without basis. The turning point came with clarity. Standing on that land again, knowing the boundaries were secure and the pressure was gone, there was a sense of stillness that hadn't existed since before the funeral. Not relief, resolve. The HOA had shown what happens when entitlement meets resistance. And they had learned it the hard way. But the true climax wasn't the acknowledgement. It was what came next. A formal recommendation was issued suggesting structural changes to the HOA, limitations on enforcement authority, mandatory legal oversight, and stricter accountability measures. The organization that had once wielded power casually was now being restrained by the very systems it tried to manipulate. Their loss wasn't just symbolic. It was systemic. And as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. The HOA didn't just lose a dispute. They lost control. The fallout was inevitable. And the resolution that followed would reshape not just the land, but the entire community. The end didn't arrive with applause or celebration. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do. After the HOA formally acknowledged it had no jurisdiction over the land, the pressure that had been constant for months simply vanished. No more letters. No more notices disguised as concern. No more fines quietly slipping into reminders or agendas. The machinery that had once hummed nonstop came to a halt, as if someone had finally pulled the plug. At first, the silence felt suspicious. When conflict lasts long enough, you don't trust calm. You wait for the next angle, the next tactic, the next attempt to regain control. But the days passed without incident. Then weeks. And gradually, it became clear that this wasn't a pause. It was surrender. The HOA had retreated because it had no other choice. The scrutiny they had invited was still unfolding, and every additional move risked deeper exposure. Their authority, once exercised with confidence, was now constrained by oversight and consequence. The land was left alone. Boundaries that had been questioned were reaffirmed and recorded. Improper notices were officially voided. Any reference to shared access or community corridors disappeared from planning documents. What had once been treated as negotiable was now recognized as untouchable. Ownership, finally, was no longer a topic of discussion. The emotional impact didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in moments that felt almost ordinary. Walking the property without wondering who was watching. Seeing fence lines without flags attached. Checking the mail without bracing for confrontation. Normalcy returned quietly, but the effects of the conflict extended far beyond one property. Inside the HOA, the fallout was unmistakable. With multiple board members gone and new leadership struggling to stabilize, residents began asking questions they had never asked before. Where dues had gone, why enforcement had been so aggressive, why legal risks were taken without proper consultation, why one homeowner had been targeted so relentlessly. Transparency, once optional, became unavoidable. Committees were restructured. Enforcement policies were rewritten. Legal counsel was required before any action involving property boundaries or jurisdiction. What had once been a board that operated on assumption and confidence was now an organization forced to justify every decision. The reminding reality was simple. Power without accountability doesn't disappear, it collapses. Residents who had once believed the HOA acted in their best interest began to see how easily authority could be misused when left unchecked. Some felt betrayed. Others felt embarrassed for not questioning sooner. A few defended the board out of habit, but their voices carried less weight than before. The culture shifted, attendance at meetings remained high, but the tone changed. Where once residents listened passively, now they questioned. Where once decisions were rubber-stamped, now they were debated. The assumption that the HOA knew best was gone. That change alone altered the balance of the community. For the first time, people understood that rules weren't immutable and authority wasn't absolute. It depended on consent, legality, and transparency, and when those were violated, consequences followed. As for the land itself, its future remained exactly as it had always been intended. There were no development deals, no concessions, no compromises disguised as cooperation. The property continued to function as it always had, quietly, responsibly, and without interference. That outcome frustrated some. The idea that something so large couldn't be absorbed or repurposed still didn't sit well with everyone. But frustration without leverage doesn't become action, and leverage was gone. The legal clarity surrounding the property was now ironclad. Every boundary had been surveyed, recorded, and cross-verified. Every document was archived. Every past attempt at interference was documented, not as grievance, but as history. There would be no second attempt. The personal impact, however, went deeper than ownership. The conflict had begun during a period of loss, a time when vulnerability made everything sharper. Having authority questioned publicly, especially in a moment meant for grief, had left a mark that couldn't be erased by paperwork or rulings. But resolution brought perspective. What the HOA had done wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a reminder of how entitlement disguises itself as concern, how control hides behind procedure, and how quickly people forget boundaries when they believe they deserve access to what isn't theirs. That lesson stayed. It reshaped how every future interaction was approached, not with hostility, but with clarity. Respect wasn't assumed. It was required. And any attempt to blur lines was met not with emotion, but with documentation and resolve. In the end, the HOA didn't just lose a fight. They lost credibility. And credibility, once gone, is almost impossible to rebuild. Residents remembered how quickly the board had escalated without authority, how aggressively it had pursued something it didn't own, how it had doubled down instead of stepping back. That memory lingered long after new leadership took over. Mistakes fade. Patterns don't. The organization continued to exist, but it did so under constraint, cautious, watched, and aware that another misstep could undo what little trust remained. The era of unchecked enforcement was over. That outcome mattered, not just for one property, but for everyone living under the HOA's reach. It changed expectations. It reminded people that compliance should never replace understanding, and that authority should never go unchallenged simply because it appears official. For the broader audience, the takeaway was even simpler. Power relies on silence. The HOA had counted on exhaustion, confusion, and grief to weaken resistance. They assumed persistence would win where legitimacy could not. What they didn't account for was preparation, patience, and the quiet strength of knowing exactly where the law stood. They pushed because they believed no one would push back. They were wrong. The resolution didn't come from aggression or revenge. It came from refusing to surrender ground that never belonged to them in the first place. From understanding that standing firm doesn't require noise, only certainty. Looking back, the conflict reshaped more than a dispute. It exposed a truth that applies far beyond HOAs or property lines. Authority that fears scrutiny is authority that shouldn't be trusted. Rules that can't survive questions were never about fairness. And systems that depend on intimidation collapse the moment someone refuses to be intimidated. The land remained quiet. The community changed. And the lesson endured. Because when entitlement meets boundaries that don't move, it doesn't adapt. It breaks. And once it does, it never holds the same power again.